guest speakers here today, so they will be doing the division meeting for us today. So we have Micah Casey and Abby Ferenzi from the Abby Center. Micah is a PAC team leader, and Abby's role is
Director of Community-Based Recovery Services. So I work with PACT, Community Support Services, recovery teams, those sort of things.
Yeah, so one of the really great things about our integration with Abby is that we can learn from each other, and through some of their grant money and some of the work they do mental health first aid, which is an 8-hour training. QPR, which I'm going to let them explain more. That's what they're going to do with us today is QPR, is another training that they've been doing around the region, and I thought that this would be a really nice training for us. Some of it may feel like, oh, I already know that, but I think a lot of it is just really good information and good reminders, and especially for some of our, actually I wouldn't say that, for newer staff as well as some of our more experienced people. I just think it's always good reminders to review some of these. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys because I know they have a full hour. And we don't want to miss any of it. Thank you.
Yes, and it's National Suicide Prevention Month as well.
Yes.
So it's very fitting that we're going to do this suicide prevention training. Again, thank you for introducing us. I'm Abby, this is Micah. QPR stands for Question, Persuade, and Refer. It's an hour-long training, so it's pretty concise. And initially when Mike and I were told we were going to become trainers, we had to go through the coursework. My initial thought was, okay, I probably already know some of this stuff. I'm a licensed counselor. This is kind of the things we do. However, after looking more into it and actually completing the study work that we did, I learned that what's really important is for us to not only understand suicidality in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives as well. And that's what it talks about with QPR. So Carol already gave us a great introduction, so I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. We start with a short video here, and then we'll get in talking about QPR.
We pull that blind down behind it.
This one?
Yeah, like blinding it. You know how it is when somebody's
Here.
saying,
She's taller than I am.
We can
okay,
also
so there is
turn the
not
lights
a blind.
on.
That bright light coming in. Huh, there is no blind up there?
No.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's silly. That is blinding. Want me to get the lights? I'll do that first.
That is really bright now. I kind of know that.
1,000 people die each year by suicide. That is more people than are killed in all the wars and homicides combined. Of these deaths each year, more than 40,000 are Americans. That is one death by suicide every 13 minutes. Suicide
Sorry, guys.
affects
Hang on just a
every
second.
region of the world.
Sorry, guys. Okay. That's pretty creative. That's pretty good.
You might just have to stand on a chair and hold it.
I know, I'll just stand here.
Wait, I think, is that gonna?
That helps.
Nobody breathe.
Nobody breathe.
Let's see.
All right, I just so we can do that.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you. That's okay. We don't want people to be blinded.
It may be hard to imagine, but according to the World Health Organization, over 800,000 people die each year by suicide. That is more people than are killed in all the wars and homicides combined. Of these deaths each year, more than 40,000 are Americans. That is one death by suicide every 13 minutes. Suicide affects every region of the world and is the third highest cause of death for people aged 15 to 44. And for every life lost, another 25 people will attempt suicide, often causing serious medical injury or lifelong disability. Today, the greatest loss of life is among working-aged men 35 to 65 years old. Men of all races and ethnicities are at higher risk. And from the very young to the very old, millions of Americans think seriously about suicide for days, weeks, and even years. Thinking seriously about suicide is itself a kind of misery index, a sign that something is terribly wrong and needs attention. Most often, what needs attention and treatment is clinical depression, a medical condition that is now the leading cause of disability in the world. In America alone, there are an estimated 15 million sufferers. Most of us are touched by suicide. Some of us have lost family members, loved ones, friends, schoolmates, or colleagues. None of us escapes the loss of people we admire and respect, whether they are people we know or are much-loved musicians, artists, and entertainers. If you have lost someone close to you to suicide, then you already know the considerable cost, the tears and awful pain of loss. And if you are one of the millions who have thought seriously about suicide, then you already know just how lonely and terrible it is to suffer alone. Depression, anxiety, substance abuse, bipolar, and thought disorders like schizophrenia all contribute great risk for suicidality. Yet most people suffering from a mental illness do not kill themselves. They get help, they find a way, and they recover to live full and productive lives. And if recovery is possible, that means suicide is preventable. Thankfully, the world is changing. We understand mental illness. We understand suicide. And we know that treatment saves lives. Right now, our teachers don't teach us about depression and suicide. And our faith leaders often struggle to talk openly about these topics. Too often, doctors can't talk to their patients about suicide, even patients who are sitting in their offices planning how to end their lives, perhaps by overdosing on the medication being prescribed to them. The world remains dangerously ignorant about suicide. So to save lives, we must bring this subject out of the shadows. Effective treatment would save thousands of lives around the world. But we must learn to talk comfortably about suicide, and we need your help to start the conversation. Join us in this fight, a fight to save lives. Preventing suicide, it's what people do.
Thanks for viewing that, put on by the QPR Institute. This is a fight. This is a fight to save people's lives, and it's a fight for people, our clients, people we know, our community, and that's what QPR is all about. Learning how to help an individual in the moment, whether, like I said, it's in our professional or our personal lives. Research shows that about half of all people who are thinking about suicide or complete suicide would never walk through the mental health center doors where we work, or the hospital. Can you go ahead and start the slideshow? Sorry, thank you. QPR is intended to be kind of like CPR. You know, when CPR was instituted, I think back in the, started as early as the 70s when they really started rolling it out, thousands of lives began to be saved because people realize that people don't always have a cardiac arrest in the hospital. It's out in the community, it's in the homes, and so like with QPR, can go back a couple, sorry, being able to do that in the moment and having a quick, kind of easy strategy to learn is something that we want to spread the word on. So, here. Is it not working? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so what will you learn from this training? National and local statistics, we're going to talk about that. Myths and facts regarding suicide, suicide clues and warning signs, and the QPR technique and how to implement each step. We're going to go over all that in the next one. Thank you. Who should learn QPR? As many people as possible. That's what we're trying to do. There are people being trained all over the country right now to be QPR trainers, and so other individuals can become gatekeepers. Like I said, people in the moment that have some simple techniques to be able to help someone through a suicide crisis. Much like CPR, like I was talking about, the fundamentals of QPR are easily learned. This is not supposed to be complex or something to where when something happens you have to think of a million steps you need to go through to get it done. No, it's simple and it's designed to save a life in the moment. QPR is not intended to be a form of counseling or treatment, I understand, you know, many of us are in the mental health field, and we do provide counseling, but that's not exactly what QPR is. It's intended to offer hope through positive action in the moment and then get that person to where they need to be. And maybe that is you, or maybe it is a colleague. Okay, the next one, thank you. So first we're gonna talk about some national suicide statistics. This is from 2017. You guys all spot Iowa on there, number 32. If you notice at the top of the list, 1, 2, and 3, Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska, what do those states have in common?
They're very sparse.
Yes. Oh, I forgot to tell you guys too.
Candy.
If you talk to us, we give you candy. There you go. Keep you awake a little bit. They are very sparse, absolutely. It's been shown that isolation can be a risk for suicide. There's something else that those states have in common as well.
Guns.
They're farmers.
Guns, okay, yes, absolutely. Shout that one out. Yes, farmers, very good. And rural communities tend to have less access to mental health services. I was surprised to learn that New York, because I think in New York, and maybe it's because I'm in Iowa and I'm biased, busy, crowded, traffic, all those types of things, but they also have a lot of mental health services, believe it or not. So just some interesting things to share with you there. In regards to national statistics as well, we have the highest rate of suicide since the Great Depression. That in itself is depressing, I bet. Rates are growing, and that is another reason, again, why we're having, doing initiatives like QPR. The next slide here. It's okay. There's a suicide in the US about once every 11 minutes. So, state of Iowa, I'd like to tell you we're faring a little bit better, but we're not. The state of Iowa, I have a handout here for you. This is actually the most recent data. Candy and handouts, thanks Micah. This is the most recent data we have for the state of Iowa. You can see there how we rank, number 9. On the back of that sheet, the reason I wanted to give this to you all too is because it talks about some of the initiatives we have in Iowa. I know talking about suicide isn't the most uplifting topic, but I do want you to know that besides people like us being trained to do QPR, there are initiatives in the state of Iowa. But Iowa's suicide rate has increased 36% over the last 17 years. 36%, one of the fastest growing in the nation. What's going on with Iowa, you guys? Farming, reducing our funding for mental health, absolutely.
A lot less mental health institutions and just places people can go for
Yep.
resources.
I have an article from the Des Moines Register about it, and they mentioned the closing of Clarinda and Mount Pleasant. Psychiatric prescribers, how are we doing in that category? Thank you. That was a really good representation of how we're doing. In fact, 2/3 of our 99 counties, or 99 of the counties, lack a mental health prescriber. Not doing so well there either. Substance abuse, opioid crisis is up. Numbers in our state aren't that great. What about access to mental health care regarding, oh, I don't know, insurance companies, managed care organizations? You might tell that I'm not a huge fan of that whole initiative. I can speak from the community end of things. It makes our job a lot harder. You have individuals like Micah and myself with the clinical background. We provide crisis intervention, daily services to clients, where we're finding ourselves more and more tied to a computer. Completing authorizations, completing denials, resubmitting. I mean, it takes a lot longer now to get someone opened in services than it did in the past. So that's what's going on in Iowa. Hopefully though, again, if you look at some of the initiatives on the back of that state of Iowa sheet, there are some things our state is working on. I also have some Linn County statistics for you. There was a study done by this Amy Hockett, PhD at Linn County Public Health, that I found, and I wanted to share some of these statistics with you. We've done these trainings in some other counties, and there weren't very many specific statistics, and this study did have that. For Linn County, Iowa, suicide is the 8th leading cause of death. In 2016, there were 40 suicide-related deaths. The rate of suicide in Lynn County has increased from 9.8 to 18.8 between 2009 and 2016. It has doubled.
Does that include like people who accidentally overdose on drugs?
That's a really good point. They actually,
They may have not been suicide. They may be
exactly. Actually, it does not include that. So the numbers, though, it's hard to tell sometimes if someone accidentally ODs or if they intentionally OD. Those are counted as overdoses, not as suicides. So the rates could be higher. Also, that goes with car accidents too. You could have an individual going 80 miles an hour that crashes into a telephone pole, and that would be deemed an accident. We'll never know if that was intentional. Let's see here. The age range, the age of suicides between 2012 and 2016 was age 12 to 95 years. Some pretty hard numbers to hear. Males are more likely to die by suicide than females, and that is consistent nationally. And the majority of individuals who died from suicide in Lynn County were Caucasian, and that's also the same. It correlates with the national statistics as well. Industry type. So, there were 26 different areas of employment identified for all those individuals who completed suicide. Can anyone tell me what the top industry was for the top, that had the highest rate of suicides? Military. It is not, but thank you for that. Yes, that's
Dennis, I don't know.
Dennis. It's not according to this. Healthcare is up there in the 26.
Farming.
Farming is the fastest growing and now is almost the highest. Yes, that's really recent statistics. We're going to talk a little bit about that too.
So we haven't guessed it yet?
You have not guessed it yet.
Is it service workers, like waiters?
No, and some of the other groups right away say social workers. In fact, though, it's shown that individuals who are aware of suicidality, mental health, and mental health services tend to have lower service or suicide rates because they're able to go get help.
Question, with Iowa having many of its organizations, Reserve and National Guard, going through 3 rotations over the past 18 years, what's the incidence increase in that? Because I know we've had a lot of casualties, a lot of mental health from that one.
The statistics I have for vets, the latest year I have is from 2016, especially for Lynn County. There were 40 in that time period deaths of military personnel. There were. That it still isn't the highest though. But thank you. Students, no. It's actually, nope. What do we have a lot of in Cedar Rapids, job-wise? Manufacturing. Manufacturing industry has the highest rate of suicide in Lynn County. Statewide, manufacturing is up there, but construction, along with farming, are the highest rates of suicide per industry. When it comes to manufacturing, why? What do you think's going on there? I mean, I know we have a lot of those jobs, but what else? Layoffs? Absolutely.
Poor pay.
Poor pay?
Long hours.
Long hours, sure.
Doing a great job compensating. I feel like if she's passing.
Now we're just gonna pass the candy out. And then someone else had mentioned farmers. The rate at which farmers are completing suicide in the state of Iowa has become alarming, especially in the past year. There's now some initiatives taking place. They created even a hotline for farmers to talk to. The Iowa State University Extension Office is creating a program to try to help farmers. What's going on with our farmers? Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't hear that.
The trade problems.
The trade problems, absolutely. Weather. Highly unpredictable industry, very unpredictable. Farmers, the work they do, they tend to be isolated a lot. So even though you might not like some of your coworkers, it's shown that it's better to be around other individuals when you're working. It's great to have that support, and farmers do not have it. Does anybody here know a farmer? Anybody know anybody? How likely would they be to, I don't know, come to the Abbey Mental Health Center and say, I need an appointment to see a psychiatrist?
Who's gonna beat my cat?
Who's gonna, yes, exactly. No, they are one of the least likely groups to seek help as well. All right, now you can stop passing out candy and take over. How'd you do?
Yeah, we made it done.
So one of the important pieces of suicide prevention is kind of going through various myths or preconceptions about suicide. And like Abby mentioned with CPR, QPR is kind of the psychological equivalent of intervening and kind of raising awareness in the community and comfortability with that intervention. So yeah, we'll go through some pre-existing false beliefs about suicide and then what the fact is that relates to it. So one myth is that no one can stop suicide, it is inevitable. This is a myth. The reality is that if people are in crisis and they're getting the help that they need, they may never experience suicidal ideation again or be in that same crisis. So it is something that there are treatment options available, there is hope. Confronting a person about suicide will only make them angry and increase the risk of suicide. This is a myth. The reality is that if you're asking somebody directly if they're feeling suicidal or checking in with how they're doing, it creates a space to have that conversation. It can lower somebody's anxiety and provide them with a sense of relief. And lowers the risk of the likelihood of an impulsive act. Another myth, only experts can prevent suicide. As we saw from video, and why we're doing QPR training is because that's not true. Suicide prevention is everybody's business. Like Abby mentioned, suicidality is not limited to our hospitals, to our community mental health centers. It's in our communities, it's in our schools, it's in our factories. So this is something that us together as a community can work to increase awareness and increase that comfort in talking about suicide. So some more myths and facts. People who are suicidal keep their plans to themselves. The reality is that most people who are experiencing suicidal ideation communicate their intent to somebody kind of at a time period before. And this communication can look different, and we'll go into that a little bit more in detail. But there are things that people say, ways that people act, different environmental contexts, things that are important to keep an eye out for. Those who talk about suicide don't do it. We don't want to make that assumption. I know when we talked about the other trainings at Unity Point, there may be some folks who come to the hospital on a regular basis, maybe those familiar faces or frequent flyers, and sometimes the reaction can be, oh, you're back again? You're still in crisis again? You're saying you're suicidal again? And it can be sometimes challenging for providers to not dismiss that. But the reality is that we don't know if somebody's going to follow through and take the steps to kill themselves. So it's important to take those signs and those communications seriously. Another myth, once a person decides to complete suicide, there's nothing anybody can do to stop them and intervene. This is not true. And kind of why we're doing this QPR training. Because suicide is the most preventable kind of death. And almost any positive action or intervention could save a life. How can I help? Asking the question, starting that conversation and talking about suicide.
So next thing we're going to talk about here are suicide clues and warning signs. The more clues and signs observed, the greater the risk. Kind of a no-brainer, but it's a good reminder. And you got to take all signs seriously. Mike is passing out a risk factor summary sheet. We made copies of this because it can be used as a tool in trying to determine if someone is at high risk for suicide. There are over 200 symptoms, diagnoses, traits, and characteristics that studies have found to be possible factors. We don't have time to go over all those today unless you wanted to stay till 10 o'clock tonight. So we're going to talk about some pretty significant risk factors. Although any of these in combination, if you have this and you're thinking about a client, a patient, someone in your personal life, if they have, the more of these they have, the higher risk they are. So let's talk about a few of these. The first one under risk factors, number 1, age. Older age accounts for 39% of suicides, but the rates of young people, 15 to 24, has soared, almost rivaled the older group. The fastest growing rate is adolescent girls. Suicide rates are going up high. What's going on with our adolescents? Social media. How many of these have we done? 12? That is the first thing shouted out every single time. You're my witness. Social media. What's so bad about social media?
Cyberbullying.
Cyberbullying. Absolutely. Anything else going on with our adolescents? I mentioned bullying. Peer pressure, sure. With bullying, we have social media, and I think young people feel the pressure to be on there, to be connected, absolutely. I do know, though, that I had bullies at my school growing up, but I could go home and not have to worry about them anymore. I had a safe place. I think the safe places for adolescents are drastically reducing because of that social media. You can't really get away from it. Anything? Yeah, well, she said shut it off. That's great. No, that's absolutely a great suggestion. Fortunately, a lot of kids feel the needs to be on there, so.
Parents working at like 2 jobs.
Yep. Sometimes, a lot of people need to work a couple jobs to keep the household afloat.
The media expectations.
Again, the internet, social media, but also the internet, there is a flood of information out there. When I was a teenager as well, there are some things my teenagers now know about that I had no clue about. No clue. And that's not just because I was naive or wasn't paying attention. There is so much information out there right now, a lot of it coming from the internet, that our adolescents, their anxiety is increasing. Lots of studies show that they're increasing. So lots of things going on there. Race, 90% are Caucasian of people who complete suicide. Men comprise 75% of suicides. It's an alarming statistic for men, and it even said it in the video. Our men are at highest risk. The professor who is part of the QPR Institute that gathered some of the statistics mentioned as well that a breakup for a man, statistically, whether it be a girlfriend, fiance, marriage, one of the highest rates of suicide there. Really hard time, in particular for a male when it comes to rates of suicide. Men tend to use more violent means, although there's a sharp increase in firearms with young people in general. I'm going to flip the page here, highlight some more of these. Number 5, psychiatric diagnosis, major depression. A lot of people, in fact, 40 to 60% of all suicides had major depression. Any comorbidity increases the risk as well. If they have depression and then say maybe they have a personality disorder or maybe they're schizoaffective, that would increase the risk of suicide. Substance abuse. Alcohol is involved in 25 to 50% of adult suicides and 70% in adolescents. Alcohol is used quite a bit when it comes to suicides. Can anybody give me a reason why?
People's judgment
Totally. Yeah, I didn't hear what you said, but what was that? Numbs the pain. You're exactly right. Numbs the pain and gives some people some liquid courage to do what they otherwise would not want to do if they were not drinking. Schizophrenia, number 8. 15% of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia will die by suicide in their lifetime. I thought that was a pretty startling number when I read it. But if you look under comments, it says the profile typically, young male unemployed with a history of premorbid higher functioning. So these are the young men, typically between ages of 18 and 22, who haven't had a lot of signs of psychosis or any issues before that, for the most part, and all of a sudden it comes out of left field and just smacks them across the face. All of a sudden, you're psychotic, and you don't know how to deal with it. I've shared in other groups before, Mike and I had to kind of think about how suicide has affected our own lives when we were doing these studies. And when I first went to University of Iowa, I had a bunch of friends go to Kirkwood here. And one of my friends called me one day and said that our friend, he's a male, I won't say his name, started acting funny recently. Saying off-the-wall things, acting spaced out, kind of disorganized. Then he started getting really paranoid, started hearing things. At one point he disrobed in front of a lot of roommates. His parents ended up pulling him out of school and taking him home. I'm from Southeast Iowa, farming community. And they took him back on the farm. And within about 2 weeks, he had taken his dad's shotgun out in the cornfield and killed himself. I've thought a lot about that since, and I want to say it's one of the reasons I went, I've really always been interested in psychology and preventing things like this, because I thought about, at the time, why didn't we figure this out? I mean, we were fairly smart, fairly, intuitive people. What was going on, and why didn't his parents figure it out? No one's to blame in a situation like that. You can only be aware of what you're aware of. I'd like to think, though, that programs like this and all the movements, I think a lot of things have happened in those past, I don't want to age myself, 20 years, have taken place to try to prevent things like that from happening, especially the stigma associated with mental illness and suicides. So, let's see here. Number 9, any previous attempt is one of the most powerful predictors of suicide. Please remember that. That is so important, you guys. Maybe you guys already all know that. I do know that when we have kind of consultations, if we're worrying about a client at risk, that's one of the first things we think about is, have they ever attempted before? Because their risk goes through the roof. If you flip the page, just a few more things I want to touch on here. Number 12, hopelessness. If you hear the word hopelessness in any form or a statement that sounds like someone has lost all hope, again, the risk for that individual raises quite a bit. The term hopelessness, and again, any words associated with it, statistics shows that people feel that way or express they feel that way if they're thinking about suicide, or people who end up to complete suicide. On the last page there, I added a few things on here. This was a pretty comprehensive list. It just didn't cover some of the historical factors that we had learned. I put on there previous suicide attempts, suicides in the family. Especially the closer the family member is to someone, the more likely, the higher risk they are for completing suicide. A lot of statistics on that. So if you have a client, patient, friend, loved one who has other individuals in their family who have completed suicide, they can be at a much higher risk if they become depressed, start using alcohol, those types of things. And then also on there is childhood abuse, trauma, or neglect. Besides some of these risk factors to be aware of, you also could find some direct verbal clues. So some of these you may or may not have heard. I've decided to kill myself. That's just coming out and saying it. There's no beating around the bush with that one. I wish I were dead. I'm going to commit suicide. I'm going to end it all. Or if such and such doesn't happen, I'll kill myself. Maybe in your professional lives, have you ever heard a patient say, if this, what's an example? If this doesn't happen, I'm gonna kill myself.
If I have to go back home.
If I have to go back home. Wow, I've not heard that one yet, but that's pretty powerful. Thanks for sharing that.
I have it kind of the opposite if my spouse leaves me.
If my spouse leaves me. Or if they don't get back together with me or something like that. Okay, yeah.
If I have to go to placement.
If I have to go to placement. Yep. If I don't get my kids back, that's sometimes what we hear. Or if, I don't know, they're on their 3rd appeal for Social Security disability. This is the last time. I know I can't work. I'm not going to get this. If I don't get it, I'm going to kill myself. We do hear that sometimes as well.
So Abby, I went through some of those direct statements, but there are also some indirect verbal cues to be keeping an eye out for. So statements such as, I'm tired of life, I just can't go on. My family would be better off without me. Who cares if I'm dead anyway? I just want out. Won't be around much longer. Statements like, I'm done. So none of these statements say the word suicide or plan I'm going to kill myself, but what are they hinting at? That hopelessness, that there isn't a solution, and nothing's going to get better. So those are important verbal cues to be keeping an eye out for as well. Pretty soon you won't have to worry about me. Statements like that that kind of hint at that somebody's not doing too great, that there may be those increased feelings of hopelessness or those depressive symptoms, important things to keep an eye out for.
Okay, behavioral clues. Any previous suicide attempt, we talked about that. Acquiring a gun or stockpiling pills. Some additional studies I've done since we started doing this, there's actually a technique out there that's called CALM. And basically if you have an individual, this probably would be more in your personal life, that you know of, that may be suicidal, the absolute best thing you or a family member can do is get guns out of their access. Lock them up, get them away. It has been shown to save a lot of lives. There's a lot of new research on that. If you can, get them away from guns. If they don't have the gun, they won't do it. Co-occurring depression, moodiness, hopelessness, there's that word hopelessness again, putting personal affairs in order.
So one example that we've kind of shared with this one is, it could be somebody making a will. At the same time, wills are kind of a normal thing for people to put together. But if it's kind of out of the norm, or if somebody is making a plan for, hey, if something happens to me, will you watch my cat? Just kind of putting those personal affairs in orders, or kind of can be a behavioral clue, an important key to kind of starting that conversation about suicide. So additional behavioral clues that they list are giving away prized possessions, so items that might be important to somebody, either holding some sentimental value or an expensive item. We had an example shared where a therapist and a client were meeting, and the client gave them like a necklace or a locket that was something that the client had always worn. And that kind of led to the conversation of, why are you giving this to the staff member? Asked why they were giving it to them, and it led to that conversation about suicide and safety. Sudden interest or disinterest in religion. So this could be somebody reaching out to get a last confession or a final meeting with their spiritual advisor. It could also be kind of distancing themselves from religion. I know there are many religious institutions that have done a lot of work to decrease stigma and kind of have that inclusivity with mental health, but there's still a lot of stigma there, and that can still be a concern for somebody, that it might jeopardize their afterlife. A lot of those stigmas or beliefs are still there, so somebody might kind of take a step back and want to distance themselves from religion. Drug and alcohol abuse, as Abby mentioned, it lowers those, it increases that impulsivity and lowers those inhibitions, where somebody might be more likely to act impulsively. And then they also make note of a behavioral clue that if you have a period of sobriety and you relapse. Why do you guys think that might be the case, a relapse?
I feel like a failure.
Failure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of that feeling of failure, exactly, that shame, that guilt, kind of ties back into that sense of hopelessness of not going to be able to do it, or nothing's going to get better. So important behavioral clues to keep an eye out for. Also some changes in mood, so unexplained anger, irritability, aggression. Like Abby had mentioned, kind of the more behavioral clues you're seeing and more of those risk factors, the higher the risk is for somebody in completing suicide or attempting suicide.
So situational clues to watch out for. Being fired or being expelled from school. A recent unwanted move. What might that look like for an adult, an unwanted move?
They moved because of their spouse's job and don't have any friends.
Exactly.
Evicted.
Eviction. We see a lot of that. But yeah, absolutely, having to move for a job, running out of money, or for whatever other reason becoming evicted. What about for adolescents, kids? What would be some unwanted moves for them?
Having to live with certain parents.
Having divorce and then they gotta live with one parent, it's
Being
huge.
taken out of the home.
If removed from the home, yep, it's a really good example. Loss of any major relationship, breakups, divorces, those types of things. Death of a spouse, child, or best friend, especially if by suicide. Should probably update this slide, because I gotta tell you, with a lot of our clients, if one of their pets died, and maybe it's not just with our clients, I don't know, I had a recent loss of a pet too. It's a family member, absolutely. And for some of the people we work with, or some of the people we know, that's their only family member. So that could be a huge indication that they might be at risk for thinking about or completing suicide. Diagnosis of a serious or terminal illness. Sudden unexpected loss of freedom. Loss of freedom, can someone give me an example of that? Getting arrested, yes.
Getting-
Going to jail,
Getting put in placement.
put in placement, yep. What about for our elderly? Oh, sorry, go
Physical problems, maybe they're in a wheelchair or something.
ahead. Yeah, true, that's a good example. Oh, I just mentioned with the elderly, what might be a loss of freedom for them? Nursing home?
Can't drive.
Can't drive, okay, yes. We see that a lot, and I know in my personal life, I have a 94-year-old grandmother, love her to death, super independent. About 3 years ago, we had to say, Grandma, we're really worried about you driving, and because she wasn't doing so well with it, and that was really hard for her. We had to keep a close eye on her for a while. She's such a fiercely independent person, still is, as much as she can be. Very, very proud, individuals are, and the elderly typically don't like to ask for help either. So if they lose that license and they become dependent on others, really hard for them. Fear of punishment, any examples for that? I think we got something in the news right now. Lori Laughlin, if you got an upcoming trial or something like that, or you think you're gonna get caught, you were committing a crime, that's another situational clue, something might be going on. Anticipated loss of financial security, I think that's a big one for our farmers. Loss of a cherished therapist, counselor, or teacher, and fear of becoming a burden to others. I talked about how the elderly might feel that way. What about a young adult? How might they become a burden to others?
Maybe they're having to rely on their parents again.
They're having to rely on their parents again. Thank you, that's a really good example. Got to move in back in with mom and dad, and maybe there's some drug use going on. Possibly they could have been physically injured and now they rely on their parents or another loved one to take care of them.
So some tips in thinking about asking the suicide question. Sometimes the word suicide sticks a little bit in people's throats. It can be anxiety provoking or scary to ask somebody that you care about if they're feeling suicidal. And there's often a misconception that by somehow using the term or the word suicide, it'll either put the idea into somebody's mind or somehow cause it to happen. But as we saw from the video and from the myths and facts section, that's not true. Asking somebody directly if they're feeling suicidal can give them a sense of relief. The reality is that if suicide is kind of on your mind when thinking about a loved one or somebody that you're working with, chances are it's crossed their mind as well. So oftentimes it can be helpful to practice. To say, and you guys can repeat after me, are you feeling suicidal?
Are you feeling suicidal?
Feels a little goofy, right? I mean, out of context right now, but it's something that kind of the more you practice it and the more you get comfortable saying it, the easier it is to say it in a time where you need to ask. So they go through some tips. If in doubt, don't wait, ask the question. This can be something that is important to kind of prioritize. So if you're worried about somebody's safety, this isn't something that you want to say, I'll check in next month, I'll check in next week. It's something that you want to prioritize and ask as soon as you can. If the person is reluctant, it's okay to be persistent. As we've kind of gone through some of those behavioral clues and warning signs, somebody might be isolating more or experiencing more depressive symptoms. And it's okay to be persistent, checking with them and then asking if they are feeling suicidal. Important to talk to somebody in a private setting. This is a pretty personal conversation to have, so not ideal to have in a busy, crowded area where there might be lots of other people overhearing. So as private of a setting as possible is ideal. Allowing the person to talk freely. So this isn't a conversation where you're telling somebody what to do or talking at them. It's really creating a space where the person can talk to you, can express their feelings. Creating that non-judgmental, empathetic place is really important. Giving yourself plenty of time. It's important to make the time to have this conversation. It's not something that you want to rush through and kind of just check the boxes. You want to be thorough in creating that empathetic and compassionate space where people can feel comfortable sharing what they need to. And then it's also important to have the resources available. So if you've kind of gone through this, you're talking to somebody, you're worried about them, and you ask them if they're feeling suicidal, and they say, yes, I have been having those thoughts. And then if you don't know what resources are out there, then you're kind of stuck with, now what? So important to kind of be aware of what resources are out there. And with the QPR booklets that we handed out, and I think there's some up front too, they do have on the last page. Like you can tear it out, put it in your wallet where it's got some helpful resources, and I think we've got some local ones as well that are helpful. It's helpful to have on hand when you need it. And then just kind of a helpful reminder, how you ask the question is less important than what you think it is. It is something that's understandable that people have anxiety talking about suicide. It can be a scary thing, for sure. So it's important to be mindful of creating that non-judgmental, compassionate space. And it's okay if you kind of bumble through the words, but it's important, like the message that you're sending is that you're an okay person to talk to and that you're not going to be met with that judgment. So some ways that they go through to kind of ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal, there are some less direct approaches that might kind of help you ease into that conversation. And they can be statements such as, have you been unhappy lately? Have you been so unhappy that you're thinking about ending your life? Do you ever wish you could go to sleep and never wake up? So none of these questions like explicitly say suicide or are you thinking about killing yourself, but they kind of get at that context of noting, hey, your mood seemed down lately, let's chat, let's have a conversation, see what's going on, I'm here for you. Are some kind of less direct ways to start that conversation. On the flip side, they go through some more direct approaches. These could be statements including, you know, when people are as upset as you seem to be, they sometimes wish they were dead. I'm wondering if you're feeling that way. Or, you're looking pretty miserable, or you're looking down. I'm wondering if you're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Statements that are kind of right to the point, checking in. But as we learned in going through the myths, asking the question directly, not beating around the bush, but directly asking somebody if they're suicidal is the most ideal way to get a direct answer and be able to kind of take the next steps for interventions. In our trainings that we did, they talked about kind of the most common responses when folks are maybe disclosing that they are feeling suicidal or having some of those thoughts. And the most common response is nothing. People don't know how to respond when they're met with that. It can be a scary thing if a loved one, if a child, or if your parent is having those thoughts, that can be scary and people aren't sure how to react to that. So this QPR training, and going over the queue of question is important to kind of familiarize yourself and increase that comfort in talking about suicide. And important to note, if you're not able to ask the question, it's important to find somebody who can. So as I mentioned a couple slides ago, maybe how you ask it is less important than you think it is. At the same time, there are things that you want to be mindful of. So they give some examples of how not to ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal. And those can include, you're not thinking of killing yourself, are you? You wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? Suicide's dumb. Surely you're not thinking about that. What message do those statements send?
Judging.
Right. It kind of shuts down that conversation right away, and the message is sending that maybe I'm not the person you can talk to about these emotions that you're experiencing or what you're going through. And I think as we've done some of these trainings, it's not that this person who's saying this is a jerk, but it kind of comes from fear. Like Abby gave a good example of one time her daughter,
Rushed out to the
young
street,
Yeah.
5 years old, and I yelled at her like really loud and angrily, and she came back and she was crying, and I couldn't believe that that was my reaction, and that I scared her because I was so angry. But I think sometimes when you're really scared, it can come out as anger. And I know when Mike and I were looking at these questions and we're thinking about what we do in our professional lives, if I'm sitting across from a client or patient and they say they're suicidal, I'm not going to say, you wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? No, I don't talk like that in my professional life. However, in our personal lives, sometimes when it's someone we love and we really care about them, we're scared when we think they're suicidal. We really are. And you might not mean to judge or to say something like, you would never do that, would you? But when you're scared, sometimes things come out like that. I had a friend once who had 3 small children at the time and was indicating that she had been really depressed and thinking about suicide. And I'll just disclose that my initial gut reaction was, oh my gosh, you've got these small kids, how could you even think of doing that? Luckily I didn't say that, but I just wanted to share that if it's someone you care about, sometimes that judgment can come out, and to just kind of check yourselves. I know some of you might be thinking too, again, I know you deal with suicidal clients in your professional lives, but a lot of this is how to be able to handle too any kind of suicide risk factors or signs you might see in your personal life too. So.
Some of those questions might actually make them want to do it even more. Because like if you're a kid and they're saying that it's a dumb idea or you didn't do anything stupid, they might, the person might think, okay, they're thinking I'm stupid, that I'm dumb.
You're,
If it's the parents that are saying that kind of stuff, they're going to be like, those are the people I care about and they don't even want to help me. What's the point?
You're exactly right.
It only takes one person to, for them to reach out to, and if that person denies them, they're like, I tried.
Unfortunately, that's what we had some case studies to go over and whatnot, and that happens. The first most popular thing that people might do, again, in their personal lives is to just not say anything, kind of ignore the statement. The second is to react with one of these, so.
And I think on the flip side of that statement too, like you said, it can take one person to kind of send somebody over the edge. It can also take one person and one intervention to save a life and to have that positive interaction. Yeah, for sure.
P, so persuade, we're in the P of the QPR. And we compared this to CPR earlier. So if you think of the Q, that's kind of like the CPR, the first part of, you guys are all trained in CPR, right? Okay. That's where you're identifying what's going on. That's why you're asking the question with the Q. The P is where you're persuading someone to stay alive. You're not responsible for keeping that person alive their entire lives. This is an in-the-moment thing, just like with CPR. You don't have to take care of that person's health the rest of their life. You're keeping them alive for now to hopefully get them the help that they need. So think of the P is like the compressions in CPR. How to persuade someone to stay alive? Listen to the problem and give them your full attention. Just showing you care sometimes can do so much. Remember, suicide's not the problem, only a perceived solution. Someone who is in that suicidal crisis thinks that that's the only solution. If you give them any other, even possible solutions, it's going to help a lot. Try not to rush to judgment and offer hope in any form. This can apply to a lot of different situations. At work isn't one thing, but in our personal lives, I've had some people bring up, well, I saw this lady at my kid's softball game and she seemed really distressed, or I saw this and that. I'm not going to walk up to certain people I don't know and start asking them if they're suicidal, which I completely understand. But I think Micah was saying too, just a kind gesture, a hi. If you have these cards in the back of your booklet, someone had given me an example of a neighbor one time they were about, maybe just slide something under their door and so say something like, hey, you're cared about, or something like that. Those small gestures really help, and unfortunately, preventing suicide is a non-statistic. We can't show how often that happens, but I guarantee those small gestures and probably some of the things that you guys do every day in your jobs help save a life, and you don't even ever get to know it.
Even I was walking through St. Luke's before I come over here, and there's a big sign that says, "You matter." That sounds a really good message, right? Like walking by that, if you're not feeling good, it can pick you up. Knowing that somebody cares and that there are people out there who care can make a difference. And that's just a sign on the wall.
More with the P, persuade portion of QPR, then ask, will you go with me to get help? Will you let me help you get help? Will you promise me not to kill yourself until we found some help? There's a lot of helps in there. That's the theme here. No matter how you say it, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have the best thing at the time to say, but you're offering help in any form. The best thing to do is to go, with someone, but just again, offering your willingness to listen and to help can rekindle hope in that moment and make all the difference to somebody.
So the R of QPR is refer. And this is like the linkage to the treatment. This is what you're doing when the emergency services arrive for the CPR. So with referrals, we're making these in our daily lives. You're asking somebody what a good restaurant is, where to get your new tires on your car from. Like, we're constantly meeting with other people and talking about referrals. Doing a referral with somebody who's experiencing suicidal ideation can be a little bit more involved though, because as we talked about with the ongoing feelings of hopelessness, if somebody's managing extra mental health symptoms, you might need to be more involved. yeah, that hopelessness. If somebody's feeling suicidal, they're not believing that there is a solution. So it's okay to be more involved in that process. The most ideal way is taking somebody directly to somebody who can help. Whether that's scheduling an appointment with somebody and going with them to there, or going to same-day access, or that direct linkage, that hand-delivered approach is most ideal to ensuring that somebody's getting the treatment or support that they're needing. The next best way to do the referral is to get a commitment from somebody that they're going to accept the help, and then helping them make arrangements. So that could be calling, getting an appointment scheduled, and then kind of getting a commitment from somebody that they're going to make it to that appointment. The third best referral option is to have those resources handy, being able to provide a list of mental health supports or hotlines or text lines that are available in our community. Any willingness to accept help is a good outcome.
Also too, I mean, we come from community-based services, so I know things might be a little different in the hospital or other community settings. When it comes to when you identify someone who's suicidal, what typically happens at that point? In your, again, professional careers?
Try to get them to the hospital.
Try to get, okay,
Or
yep.
Try to get them into help.
Try to get them into help, okay.
Even that crisis mobile.
Yeah, I was gonna say foundation too. We are so lucky that we have that. Not a lot of our counties do. Yeah, any kind of way that you can give help. It isn't always, a lot of these examples sometimes are talking more about in our personal life. We have talked about before that sometimes we talk to a supervisor, sometimes we do a complete suicide assessment, those types of things. So remember, since almost all efforts to persuade someone to live instead of attempt suicide will be met with agreement and relief, don't hesitate to get involved or take the lead. You might be thinking that, say in your personal life, if you ask someone if they were feeling like killing themselves, they might be a bit defensive. And that could happen, They could be like, what are you talking about? There's nothing, I'm not crazy, because there's this stigma that anyone who feels suicidal is crazy, and that's absolutely not true. But research shows that most individuals actually want to be asked. Have you ever been at work, having a really bad thing go on in your personal life, you're trying to hold it together, you're doing your stuff at work, and all of a sudden maybe a coworker that you have a good friendship with comes up to you and says, "Are you okay? How are you doing?" I mean, and then just, it's like, no, I'm not actually. I've got a lot of stuff going on. That relief of not having to put up that front and not having to hold that all in, even though you still have to end up doing your job the rest of the day, it's nice that somebody asks you that question. You can say, no, actually, I'm not all right. I'm really not all right, and I kind of need some help. Research shows, again, that if you ask someone if they're feeling suicidal, most of the time they are going to be relieved that you asked them. And there are a lot of people who will not ask for help. Farmers, again, they do not ask for help. You've got to ask them first. For effective QPR, say I want to live or I'm on your side. We'll get through this. Get others involved if you can, the family, friends, pastors, bishop, physicians, whoever you can. The more people that can help, if possible. For effective QPR, follow up with a visit, a phone call, a card, and in whatever way feels comfortable to you. I know there's a variety of situations out there. Let the person know you care about them. Caring may save a life. When you apply QPR, you plant the seeds of hope, and hope helps prevent suicide. Again, in the field that you're in, you're already doing it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in our nation right now. There's a lot of things that worry us, and people don't seem to have answers. I do know that you sitting in this room and all of us working in the mental health field are part of the solution to a very big problem. So you're already doing some of these things. QPR is just intended to kind of spread that out to everybody else as well, to try to be a part of the solution. So thank you everybody for listening today.
Thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
I have a couple questions. With the risk factors, how does somebody like not having a religion that they believe in, how does that affect suicide?
There isn't any, I don't have any research on that. I'm not sure. I could take a couple guesses. I think that sometimes, especially when people are psychotic or depressed, at least from this is speaking from experience, they tend to talk more about religion and those types of things, and it's really important to them. But I wouldn't say necessarily an absence of having a religion or believing in a higher power would increase suicide risk. unless, for some people, they have that guilt associated with the religion that actually stops them. I've heard someone say before, I would have done it, but I don't want to go to hell.
So like, what about the lack of it though? Like some people, if they are religious, that gives them some sort of hope, some sort of meaning in life and a purpose.
And without it, yes, you're right, that could be for some people not to have that kind of higher power to look through. You talk about faith and faith getting people through really hard times. Yes, that could affect people who don't have that.
What about self-harm for you guys? You guys see a lot of people that originally start with that, and then because that's not enough, they end up committing suicide?
It's generally, like, it is a risk factor and something that you want to be mindful of. But generally, they're kind of different avenues of, with self-harm, it can be more of like a release or a coping strategy to kind of process trauma or painful experiences. And I don't know the exact statistics.
Oh, on self-harm, like you said, it's kind of a different ballgame. However, sometimes there are suicides when someone went too far with self-harm and we're not sure whether they really meant to kill themselves or not.
But an important thing to be mindful of and would be a risk factor to keep in mind.
Because typically they're depressed or have anxiety, which would be a risk factor as well. But that's a good statistic to look for, how many people who've completed suicide have self-harmed before. That wasn't in all of the stuff that we got, so that's a good
Kind
thing.
of what you said, what we see a lot of times, people say it's a good release of pain.
Yeah.
It's a numbing feeling, it makes them feel good, but then
Mhm.
sometimes if you're doing that frequently and it's not enough, and you're just, tired of
You're
it
looking
and
for
can't
more.
get rid of those feelings, does that lead to?
Oh, that's a really good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming today.